The wind had teeth, and it was biting hard at the edges of Redemption Gulch. Eli Hartley felt it on the back of his neck, a cold promise of what was coming. He leaned against the rough-hewn porch post of the general store, his weight settled on one leg, his hat pulled low, his gaze fixed on the mountain pass. A jagged cut in the gray muscle of the peaks where the stagecoach road disappeared. It was the last one of the season. After this, the snows would close that pass like a fist, and the world would shrink to the size of his valley until spring. He was not a man given to impatience, but a quiet tension coiled in his gut. Answering the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times had been an act of pure, cold logic. His homestead was 2 days, ride from anywhere, a lonely patch of existence carved out of timber and rock. Winters were the worst. The silence grew so loud it felt like a presence in the cabin, a ghost that sat in the empty chair across from him. He didn't need a wife for love. The notion was as foreign and impractical as raising orchids in a blizzard. He needed a partner, someone to share the burden, to keep the crushing solitude at bay. The advertisement he'd answered had been simple: plain woman of good character, seeking husband and home, willing to work and share the hardships of frontier life. He had sent back an equally plain reply, enclosing the fare for her passage. He expected someone sturdy, with hands used to work, and a face weathered by practicality. He expected a woman who understood survival. The distant rumble of wheels grew louder, and finally the stagecoach lurched into view, coated in a fine layer of dust that looked like a premonition of snow. It pulled to a halt in a jangle of tired harnesses and the blowing of weary horses. A few townsfolk, bundled in wool and buckskin, paused their errands to watch. The arrival of the stage was always an event, but the last one before winter carried a special weight. It was the final link to the world outside, and everyone who got off it was here to stay, for better or worse. The driver, a burly man named Silas, whose beard was stiff with ice, swung down and opened the door. A man in a drummer's suit got out first, stamping his feet and muttering about the cold. Then, after a long pause, she appeared. A collective murmur rippled through the onlookers. This was not what anyone had expected, least of all Eli. The woman who stepped down onto the frozen mud was thin, so slender a hard wind might have carried her away. She was trembling, a fine, constant tremor that shook the delicate lace collar of her dress. The dress itself was a whisper of a thing. Dark blue wool trimmed with fragile adornments meant for eastern parlors, not the edge of the wilderness. It was wholly inadequate for the cold, and she seemed to fold into herself, arms wrapped tight around her body. Eli pushed himself off the post. He heard the whispers. "Too fine for this place, look at her. A sparrow in a hawk's nest." Hartley's got himself a porcelain doll. He ignored them. His world had long since been pared down to what was necessary, and the opinions of others had been one of the first things to go. He walked toward her, his boots making a steady sound on the frozen dirt. Her head was down, but she must have sensed his approach, because she flinched when he stopped in front of her. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, like a rusty hinge. She gave a short, jerky nod, her throat working as if to swallow a word that wouldn't come. The wind gusted again, whipping a strand of dark brown hair across her pale cheek. She shivered violently. Without a word, Eli shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat. It was worn and smelled of pine smoke, leather, and cold mountain air. He held it out to her. When his hand brushed her arm, she recoiled. It was not a large movement, just a sharp, involuntary jerk, as if she'd been burned. Her eyes darted to his hand, then back to his face, wide and wild with alarm. He did not understand. For a moment, he thought she might bolt. He held his ground, his hand still extended, the coat a silent offering. He kept his expression calm, his posture easy, the way a man would approach a spooked mare. Finally, the logic of the cold won out over her fear. She gave another small nod, her lips pressed into a thin white line. She allowed him to drape the heavy coat over her narrow shoulders. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging far past her hands. the hem brushing her ankles. She clutched the lapels together at her throat. A small, dark figure lost inside a mountain man's world. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were barely carried on the wind. He retrieved her luggage, a single battered satchel that she had kept beside her on the coach seat. She reached for it immediately, her fingers closing around the handle with a desperate grip, as if it contained her very soul. "My wagon's over here," he said quietly, gesturing with his head. The ride back to his homestead was steeped in silence. The wagon wheels groaned through the frozen ruts of the trail, and the wind moaned through the pines. Eli sat straight, his hands sure on the reins, his focus on the path ahead. He was acutely aware of the woman beside him, a rigid shape wrapped in his coat, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her knuckles white on the handle of her satchel. He risked a glance. Her profile was delicate, carved fine, but drawn tight with exhaustion and strain. She looked like a woman who had been running for a long time and had only just realized there was nowhere left to go. The silence between them wasn't companionable. It was a chasm, and Eli had no idea how to bridge it. He thought of things to say, questions about her journey, but they all felt like intrusions, so he said nothing. By dusk, they reached the cabin. It sat nestled in a clearing backed by thick pine, smoke curling from the chimney into the darkening sky. A sturdy structure of rough logs and hard work. To him, it was home, a fortress against the winter. To her, it looked like the end of the world. He helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her. Inside, the main room was spare but orderly. A stone fireplace glowed faintly. A rough-sawn table and 2 chairs stood near the center. His bed, a simple frame with a thick wool blanket, occupied one corner. The air smelled of coffee and wood smoke. "The stove's there," he said, pointing. "Keeps the place warm. The well's out back, but I brought in extra water for tonight." He led her to a small room partitioned by a new wooden wall. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed, a washstand, and his mother's old patchwork quilt, the only soft thing in the house. "This will be your room," he said. She stepped inside, her movements stiff. She touched the quilt lightly, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," she said softly. "It is very clean." He nodded. As she set her satchel down, he saw her hands in the lamplight, dark, mottled bruises across her knuckles and wrists. "How did you hurt your hands?" he asked before he could stop himself. She froze. Then, hiding them quickly in the folds of her dress, she murmured, "I fell." The lie hung heavy in the air. Eli didn't press her. He knew a wall when he saw one. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane. Snowflakes began to swirl in the twilight. The pass would be closed by morning. They were stranded together. That night, as he sat by the fire listening to the wind rage, he heard it, a soft sound through the wall. Quiet, muffled weeping. Not loud grief, but a sound of someone trying hard not to cry. He stared into the fire, motionless. He didn't know what ghosts she carried, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had driven her here had left its mark deep. And now, in this cold cabin on the edge of the world, their long winter together had just begun. Cora woke before dawn. The cabin was cold, the fire having burned down to pale coals. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then it all came back. The journey, the silent man, the endless snow. A wave of despair washed over her, but beneath it flickered a stubborn ember of resolve. She would not be useless. She would earn her place. She rose quietly, pulling on her plain wool dress. Her hands ached as she reached for the kindling. She had never built a fire in her life, but she had watched others do it. She opened the grate, stacked the wood awkwardly, and struck a match. The kindling slipped, clattering against the iron stove. From behind her came a low voice. "The flue needs to be open." She froze. Eli Hartley sat up in bed, his movements quiet and efficient. He came to the stove, pulling the lever on the pipe. Then he took the kindling from her and rearranged it with steady hands. He struck another match and coaxed the flame to life. It caught, crackled, and began to spread warmth through the room. "You have to let the air in," he said simply, "or it'll smoke you out." "I was only trying to help," she whispered. "I know." In the new light from the fire, he saw her face clearly. There were dark circles under her eyes and a drawn look around her mouth. Yet there was also something stubborn there, something that refused to surrender. It stirred something in him he couldn't quite name. The days settled into a rhythm. She learned to help with chores, though everything was foreign to her. Eli showed her how to feed the horses and gather water from the well. She followed him in silence, wrapped in his oversized coat, her face pale against the cold. He noticed how she flinched at sudden sounds, how her eyes darted toward any unexpected movement. She was like a wild creature that had learned not to trust the world. She tried to chop wood once, her small hands gripping the axe. It was almost painful to watch. The handle slipped, the blade bit only halfway through the log. Eli stepped forward, took the axe from her without a word, and split a dozen pieces in clean, effortless swings. He didn't mock her, he just stacked the pieces beside her and said, "That'll do." Inside the cabin, she found her own strengths. She sewed with neat, perfect stitches, mended his clothes, scrubbed the floor until the wood shone, and filled the cabin with a quiet order. She was always moving, as if afraid that stillness might let the past catch up. Sometimes Eli would watch her by the fire, her face soft in the glow, her hands busy with her needle. For those moments, the fear left her eyes, replaced by calm concentration. Those were the moments he began to breathe easier. Then the storm came. It swept down from the mountains with no warning, a screaming white wall of wind and snow. The world vanished beyond the window. The cabin groaned under the force of it. For 3 days they were trapped inside. The cold was merciless. Even with the fire blazing, the air turned sharp and biting. Their breath hung in clouds before their faces. Eli stuffed rags into the cracks of the walls, but the wind found its way through anyway. By the second night, they were burning through their woodpile faster than he'd planned. "We'll have to sit close to the hearth," he said, his tone grim. He spread their blankets on the floor near the fire. They sat side by side, wrapped separately in wool, a yard of icy air between them. It was an awkward kind of closeness. He was acutely aware of her small, shivering form beside him. He could smell the faint scent of her hair soap, a clean, gentle smell that felt foreign in his rugged world. Cora was aware of him too. She could feel his warmth through the space that separated them, and somehow that distance hurt more than the cold. He angled his body away from her, careful not to invade her space, but she noticed the way his hands rested on his knees, large, steady, motionless, as if he feared what they might do if left unchecked. At night, changing clothes became an act of silent choreography. She would turn her back to the fire, loosening the ties of her dress. He would rise and face the wall, giving her privacy that the small cabin could not. It was a small kindness, but one that pierced her more deeply than any grand gesture. She had lived under the hands of a man who claimed ownership over every inch of her body. To have another man deliberately look away, it felt like a miracle. By the third night, the storm reached its peak. The fire was dying, the cold pressing in like a living thing. Cora stood with her back to the fire, her fingers trembling as she tried to untie the laces of her dress. Her hands were numb, useless. She tried again and again, but the knot wouldn't come loose. Tears of frustration stung her eyes. She didn't want to ask. Asking for help had always led to pain, but the cold was too cruel. "Mr. Hartley," she whispered. He turned his head. "Eli," he corrected gently. "Eli," she said, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "I cannot undo my laces. My hands are too cold." For a long moment he didn't move. Then he rose slowly and crossed the floor. Instead of standing behind her, towering over her, he knelt. The act took her breath away. A man lowering himself before her was something she had never seen. "Hold still," he murmured. His fingers brushed the small of her back, rough and warm through the thin fabric. He worked carefully at the knot, his touch patient, precise. She felt the warmth of him close behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She expected fear to rise like it always did, but it didn't. His touch carried no demand, no ownership, only quiet intent. The knot came loose. He didn't speak. He rose and turned away immediately, facing the fire. "Your dress is undone," he said softly. She stood frozen, her heart pounding. The air between them was thick with something she couldn't name. Something that wasn't fear, but wasn't safety either. Something new. That night, neither of them slept much. The storm screamed outside, but inside the cabin another storm was brewing. Quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous. It was the kind of storm that didn't destroy things. It changed them. When morning came, the wind had died. Snow buried the world outside in silence. But the world inside had shifted too. The cold cabin was no longer empty. There was a warmth now, a fragile, unspoken warmth that neither dared to name. And it all began with a single, gentle touch. The storm finally broke, leaving behind a world of white silence. The snow lay deep, gleaming under a pale sun, and the air felt almost holy in its stillness. Inside the cabin, the silence carried a different weight. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two souls trying to understand what had changed between them. Eli worked to dig out the path to the barn, the sound of his shovel steady and sure. Inside, Cora moved through her chores with quiet purpose. The fear that had once ruled her every movement was easing, melting like the snow outside. She laughed softly once when a chicken escaped its pen and fluttered around her skirts. The sound was brief, uncertain, but to Eli, it felt like hearing music for the first time in years. Each day, the wall between them thinned. When she set a bowl of stew before him at night, her hand would brush his. When he passed her a mug of coffee in the morning, his fingers would linger just a heartbeat too long. Their words were few, but their silence was full. Then one evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Cora began to cough. At first, it was small, barely noticeable, but by morning her cheeks were flushed, and she shivered under her blankets. The fever came quickly, burning through her small frame. Eli's gut clenched with fear. Redemption Gulch had no doctor, and the storm had left the trails impassable. He was all she had. He worked like a man possessed. He melted snow for water, fed the fire, brewed bitter tea from dried herbs his mother had once gathered. He wiped her brow and whispered quiet words, though he wasn't sure if she heard them. Her fever dreams came in broken gasps, filled with names and fears he didn't understand. "Julian," she whispered again and again. "Please, no more." The name struck him like a knife. Julian, the man she had fled from, the ghost that haunted her eyes. Each time she spoke it, Eli's heart hardened with fury toward a man already gone. He wanted to dig him from the grave, just to kill him again. When the fever finally broke, dawn was touching the snow outside with gold. Cora stirred, her skin damp with sweat but cooler now. Her eyes opened, dazed and distant. She looked at him, saw the exhaustion in his face, and whispered, "I'm sorry." "For what?" he said gently. "You were sick." "I spoke," she murmured, her voice small, "in my sleep." He nodded. "You said a name." She turned her head away, shame shadowing her face. "He's dead," she said at last. "But he broke me before he left." Quote, Eli said nothing. He reached out and took her frail hand in his large one. For a long moment, he simply held it, his thumb tracing slow circles across her bruised knuckles. Then he leaned closer, his voice rough but steady. "You're not broken, Cora. You're still standing." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. And for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, she let herself believe that maybe he was right. The days that followed were quiet and full of small mercies. She healed. The color returned to her cheeks, and her laughter came easier. They spent their evenings by the fire, reading from his mother's old books. He read slowly, his deep voice rumbling low and calm, and she listened, eyes closed, smiling at the sound. Sometimes she would hum the soft tunes her mother once played on the piano. The cabin began to feel like home. Then came the night when the cold returned. The fire burned bright, and they sat together on the blankets before it, closer than ever before. Their words drifted into silence. She looked at him, her face bathed in firelight, and reached out her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed his, then slid over his rough knuckles. She took his hand and placed it flat against her chest, over her heart. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, still beating. He could. It was strong and steady under his palm. He could feel her warmth, her courage, her life. Then she said it, soft, trembling, but clear. "Touch me like you mean it." The words weren't a command or a plea. They were a bridge between them, built on trust that had been earned one heartbeat at a time. Eli's breath caught. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His lips met hers. Slow, careful, reverent. It wasn't hunger. It was belonging. The firelight flickered around them, painting their shadows against the log walls as two broken lives wove themselves together. In that cabin, where the cold had once been endless, warmth bloomed. Spring came slowly to Redemption Gulch. The snow melted, and water ran singing down the mountainsides. The valley turned green again, alive with the promise of life. One morning, the first stagecoach of the season rolled into town, carrying mail and gossip and news from faraway cities. A letter arrived, sealed in fine script. It was addressed to Mrs. Julian Whitmore. When Cora saw it, all color drained from her face. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. She read only a few lines before the letter slipped from her fingers. "He knows where I am," she whispered. It was from Julian's brother, Thomas Whitmore, a man who considered her his family's property. He was coming to take her back. Eli read the letter and felt the same quiet rage he'd felt the day he saw the bruises on her hands. "He won't take you," he said. "This is your home now." But she shook her head. "You don't know the Whitmores. They don't let go of what they claim." 2 days later, they saw him. 3 riders coming up the valley. Thomas rode at the front, tall, polished, dressed in fine Eastern clothes that looked ridiculous in the wilderness. 2 hired guns rode behind him. He stopped in the clearing, his voice sharp and cold. "Cora, this foolishness has gone on long enough. Come out. You belong to your family." Eli's hand rested on the rifle. His voice was steady when he answered, "She belongs to no one." The first shot cracked through the air. Wood splintered near the window. Eli shoved Cora down behind the table and fired back. The sound filled the small cabin. Thunder and fury. A bullet tore into Eli's shoulder, spinning him against the wall. Pain burned white-hot, but he stayed upright. Then Cora saw the rifle fall. She saw the blood spreading through his shirt. The world narrowed to that one sight. Without thinking, she crawled for the gun, her hands shaking. She remembered his words, "Breathe out slow. Squeeze, don't pull." She rose to her knees, aimed through tears, and fired. The shot rang out. Outside, a man fell soundless into the snow. Silence followed. The other riders turned and fled down the valley, leaving the dead where he lay. Inside, Cora dropped the rifle, shaking all over. She turned to Eli, who was pale but alive, clutching his wounded shoulder. She crawled to him and pressed her face into his chest, sobbing, "I didn't want to kill him." He wrapped his good arm around her. "You didn't kill a man," he said quietly. "You saved your life." Quote. Later, when the sheriff came, he called it self-defense. The town whispered, as towns do, but Cora no longer flinched at their words. She had faced her past and survived it. A week later, Eli stood beside her in the cabin. Outside, the world was greening again, life returning to the land. He took her hand in his, rough against delicate. "Cora," he said softly, "I'm not asking you to marry me for protection or for what people think. I'm asking because I love you. Because I choose you." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "And I choose you," she whispered. "Every day." That spring, they were married beneath the pines, with no preacher and no ring but one he carved from wood. The wind carried their vows across the valley. The cabin was no longer cold. It was warm, with laughter, with the smell of bread baking, with the quiet peace of two scarred hearts that had found their home. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the window, Cora stood barefoot on the porch. Eli came behind her, wrapping his old sheepskin coat around her shoulders, the same coat he had once offered to a frightened stranger. She smiled, taking his rough hand and pressing it against her heart. "See?" she whispered. Still beating. He kissed her softly, tasting sunlight and coffee and the promise of forever. The wind whispered through the pines, and for the first time, the frontier didn't feel lonely. It felt alive.